You hear me complain quite a lot about modernity. Many channels like mine in fact do that, but it's not quite clear what that actually means. Many of you might have heard of the term cultural Marxism. This word has quite the story behind it, and we will explore that today. Throwing this term into any search engine gets you here. Wikipedia will let you know that cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Alright, well, that seems to be the entire entry on the concept more or less. Labeled, applied, case closed. Just move along. I mean, surely you can be rerouted to Western Marxism, but I would like you to notice what this does to you. What just happened. Not because the Wikipedia editors are necessarily wrong that the term cultural Marxism is sometimes used by bad faith actors. They're not entirely wrong about that, but not entirely right either. It is, however, the disclaimer itself, taking an idea, attaching a scarlet letter to it, and declaring the conversation to be over is actually a perfect demonstration of the thing that we're going to talk about today. The Frankfurt School developed a method for neutralizing any idea they found too dangerous, by not necessarily refuting them on their own basis, but by engaging them. You have to locate the political valence within the idea, and this very naming becomes sufficient ground for dismissal. Welcome to critical theory, ladies and gentlemen. But to properly understand that, we need to actually look at what the Frankfurt School is, where it came from and who made it, and most importantly, what it has done to us. Because these ideas, they didn't really stay in the university seminar rooms that they originated from, they got out. And we are living in the very real consequences of this. To understand the Frankfurt School, you have to understand the specific texture of Jewish life in German-speaking Europe in the late 19th century. See, German Jews by this period occupied a strange position. Legally emancipated since the 1870s, they were formally citizens, but, well, formal equality and social equality are two different things. Universities had soft quotas. Senior civil service positions were effectively closed to them, and the officer corps remained largely inaccessible either. For a Jewish man of high intelligence and serious ambition in 1890, the available options were narrow: law, medicine, finance, journalism, and academia, but only in certain departments. Professions of the mind and the word, one could say. That's of course not incidental. When you systemically exclude a population from building things like armies, bureaucracies, or industrial empires and funnel them toward law courts and lecture halls, as well as editorial offices, you produce, over generations, a community with a very particular set of abilities. A community of interpreters, analysts, arguers. The Talmudic tradition was already like this, as it uses argument as epistemology, debate as sacred practice. The text is something to be wrestled with rather than just simply received. The social pressures of diaspora life in Europe probably reinforced that. Exposing any community to a particular environment long enough, you get adaptation, just by necessity alone, and the Frankfurt School thinkers were the inheritors of several generations of this adaptation. Almost every account of this period flattens out into one narrative. But the Jewish community in Weimar Germany was not really one unified bloc with a single response to its situation. It was heterodox, fractured, arguing with itself constantly, as you would expect from a community shaped by centuries of Talmudic debate. You had on one hand the deep assimilationists, Jews who had embraced German identity so thoroughly that they experienced it as their primary one. Many of these men enlisted enthusiastically in the First World War, not necessarily under duress, but out of genuine patriotism. They, in a sense, believed in the project of being German. They wore the uniform, went to the front and died in the mud, and came home, if they came home, to find the Durchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, waiting for them. It was the accusation that people like them had sabotaged Germany from within. The betrayal alone is almost operatic in its cruelty. You have proven your loyalty with your own body, and yet the country calls you a traitor anyway. On another and entirely different angle, you had incipient Zionists, people who had concluded, often before 1914, that assimilation was a dead end, that the European project would never fully accept them, and that the only rational response was to build something of their own elsewhere. Famously, Herzl had already made this argument. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 gave all of this formal momentum. And then, scattered across the spectrum in between, you had every imaginable variation just like today. Religious conservatives, secular socialists, liberal democrats, cultural nationalists, radical internationalists, and naturally people who simply wanted to be left alone to run their own businesses and raise their families. Today, however, we will focus on the Institute for Social Research, as it reflects this heterodoxy quite well. It was funded by Felix Weil, the son of a wealthy grain merchant, who himself does not pass the early life check. He is a committed Marxist and essentially bankrolls the institute into existence. This gives it financial independence to operate outside the state and party control. This is worth sitting with because the intellectual infrastructure for radical critique of bourgeois capitalism was founded itself by inherited bourgeois capital. Funny how the more things change, they stay the same. The contradiction is not necessarily incidental, it's actually quite illuminating about the class position of many of these thinkers, radical in theory and comfortable in practice, with no direct experience of the proletarian conditions they theorized about. That sounds quite familiar, doesn't it?
That's what you saw. I never said I fucking grew up in poverty. As a matter of fact, I've openly stated that I grew up fairly affluent in Turkey.
Yet, there were also, at the furthest extreme, responses to the German persecution later on that went in the opposite direction entirely. See, it didn't go toward internationalism and deconstruction, but rather toward a kind of mirror nationalism. Of course Herzl, but even more extreme there's Theodor Neumann Kaufmann's 1941 book, Germany Must Perish, it reads. It calls for the sterilization of the entire German population as a solution to the supposed problem of German aggression. It is a document of extraordinary hatred, and it is a document produced by someone who had watched what Germany was doing to people like him. Kaufmann is not a Frankfurt School figure, obviously, but he represents the other end of the same psychological pressure. No sublimation into critical theory, but instead the maximalist exterminationist revenge fantasy. The wound pushed far enough in the other direction. There's obviously no moral equivalence, however, between Kaufmann and Horkheimer. The point is much more simple. Extreme historical pressure produces extreme responses, and they're not all the same response, obviously. The Frankfurt School is one adaptation, Zionist ethno-nationalism is another, assimilationist martyrdom is another, Kaufmann's particular madness is another. Treating any of these as the single Jewish response to modernity is to kind of miss the actual story entirely. And I think that is probably how you get a free Wikipedia entry sticker on your video. Let's see if I get my first one. Now, the First World War kind of breaks something in the spirit of the people. For the assimilationists, the men who had staked their identity on being German, the war followed by the Durchstoßlegende is a psychological catastrophe. You bled for a country, and this very country blamed you now for its own bleeding. And now a new political movement is rising, louder every year, that has decided that you are the fundamental problem. In this environment, what are the available intellectual political vectors for a young Jewish man in Weimar Germany? Well, nationalism is probably not really advisable. Liberal democracy is discredited by the war, structurally weak and incapable of holding the center against the pressure building on both extremes. And, worst of all, it is French. Then there's the left, which, well, at least in its internationalist form, looked past ethnicity. It offered a frame in which the Jew wasn't the problem, well, at least not directly. The class system was the problem. It offered for the first time in a long time a vision in which the Jewish intellectual wasn't an outsider looking in, but instead a fellow traveler in a universal project. There's quite a lot of people like that, and thus there was an overrepresentation of Jews inside the Bolshevist movement, which is often cited. Now there is a historical footnote, however, that kind of complicates this picture in an interesting way. See, this dynamic of Jews going into the Bolshevist movement was actually not universal. In Italy, many Jewish citizens were active members of the fascist party, at least until Mussolini adopted racial laws in 1938 under German pressure. See, Primo Levi's own father was a card-carrying fascist. The point being that the leftward vector of the Frankfurt School's thinkers was not an inevitability, but it was a response to a specific national context, one in which the right was more or less inhospitable. And this is in part the reason why we get this kind of idea from this kind of group. Now, Weimar Germany is one of the most intellectually alive and politically unstable societies in modern history. Every ideology has a newspaper, a militia, a theory of history. The streets are contested terrain. The parliament is in constant crises. The economy is likewise a disaster. Hyperinflation in the early 20s and then deflation and mass unemployment after 1929. Culturally, it's all over the place and kind of familiar. Prostitution and degeneracy is at an all-time high. Too many widows, veterans, and fatherless daughters. The same nation that will venerate the fascist aesthetic opened the first gender clinic 100 years before it was cool. Underneath all of that, there are two movements that are growing, that are, in a deep structural sense, mirror images of the other. Both the communists and the National Socialists are heirs to the same philosophical inheritance. I call that Hegelian history. It is the idea that there's a direction to things, a resolution coming, a contradiction that will have to be overcome. I did already explore this in a different video. The short version of it is that Marxism dissolves its way to utopia, while Nazism crystallizes its way there. Both of them promise an end to the struggle and both require you to identify and eliminate whatever stands in the way, be it the rich people or the other people. The Frankfurt School thinkers were watching both movements from close range, and in 1933, one of them won. Now, the Institute for Social Research itself was founded in Frankfurt in 1923, privately funded by the already mentioned Felix Weil, which gave it unusual independence from state and party orthodoxy. It was explicitly Marxist in orientation, but very unorthodox. They were willing to ask questions that Moscow-line Marxists considered settled. The key figures in this are Max Horkheimer, of course. He is the Institute's director, the organizer and the one who sets the theoretical agenda. His central obsession is actually a very good question. Why doesn't reason liberate us? Why does the Enlightenment, the great project of modern human rationality, keep producing its own opposites? Then there's Theodor Adorno, probably the most intellectually formidable of the group and certainly the most difficult to read. He's a philosopher, musicologist, and sociologist. His work ranges from jazz criticism to studies of fascist psychology. He co-authors The Dialectic of Enlightenment with Horkheimer, arguably the central text of the entire Frankfurt School. If you ever thought someone had bad taste, just you wait until we discuss him properly. Then there's Herbert Marcuse, the one who actually breaks through the seminar room. His ideas reach the 1960s counterculture, the student movements, the New Left, and he becomes generally famous. He also, interestingly, works for the OSS during the war, the precursor to the CIA. The radical theorist of liberation is employed by American intelligence. We'll return to what this means at a later point. Now, when Hitler comes to power in 1933, the Institute relocates. First to Geneva, then to Paris, then to Columbia University, New York. The Frankfurt School does much of its most important work in American exile, looking back at the ruins of the Europe it came from. From this exile, the Frankfurt School formulates its central problem. Why did the German working class follow Hitler instead of Marx? Now, that's actually quite the funny question. According to Marx, the workers shouldn't have sided with the Nazis. Communism is inevitable, you see. It's the natural solution to history. Well, except when it isn't. See, the material conditions were all there. The economic crisis was catastrophic. The workers were radicalized and they went, not to the Communist Party, but to a movement that explicitly promised to destroy Marxism and exterminate the people most associated with it. If you have a theory that's not slightly off, that is pretty much as off as you can be. Thus, they experienced a catastrophic falsification of the Marxist model in real time, and it happened to them personally. See, for the Marxist, the base was supposed to determine the superstructure. The material conditions were supposed to drive class consciousness, and this class consciousness was supposed to drive the revolution. This didn't happen. Something must have been wrong about the theory. And the Frankfurt School is, at its core, an attempt to figure out what is wrong with it. It is here where I want to point something out that is quite underappreciated in most discussions of these thinkers, because there is a very deep psychological dimension to this entire project. These are not detached scholars performing value-neutral analysis. They're quite smart, displaced men formed, more or less, within the German cultural tradition, watching from exile as this very tradition attempts to exterminate their kind. Horkheimer and Adorno write The Dialectic of Enlightenment between 1941 and 1944 in Los Angeles, while the Holocaust is happening. You cannot read this very book purely as philosophy. It is also grief, a coping mechanism in a way, the very human need to make sense of what is happening. If you can build a theoretical framework that explains how Auschwitz emerges from Enlightenment rationality, then the world still has an order to it. The alternative, that this was just chaos, barbarism or the void, is somehow harder to bear. Hidden within these assumptions is an illness that we all kind of have in modernity. They, as well as us, arrive at this because there's something that they cannot bring themselves to follow to its logical conclusion. And that is that fascism and Marxism are, at the base, the same movement pointed in different directions. To fully comprehend fascism would mean to understand that, but they cannot accept this, because they are Marxists. The Marxist views the world through the lens of progression. Any idea that is not necessarily theirs or leads to the same conclusions is fundamentally a step backwards instead of a different path. This is why the Frankfurt School builds a framework that explains fascism as the perversion of modernity, when it is really its twin, instead of a regression. It is this very analysis that I would like to call the compensatory function of critical theory, because it actually does quite a lot of real intellectual work, but it also is, in a very transparent way, a big coping mechanism for the Marxists. And, like most coping mechanisms, it carries in itself a lot of pathologies with it. Now, before we go any further into what these ideas actually are and what they have done to us, I want to establish a frame. National Socialism was, among other things, Germany's compensatory mechanism for the traumata of the First World War. A country that had been humiliated, economically destroyed and stripped of territory is then handed a guilt clause that it cannot psychologically metabolize. This frustration needed somewhere to go. Hitler offered, the German people and himself, quite the convincing story. See, we didn't really lose. We were dogpiled upon and then betrayed by enemies from within, by some people who were never really German to begin with. And once we have identified and removed these betrayers, Germany will be restored to its true greatness. It is, in the most transparent of ways, a revenge fantasy made into a political program. Psychologically, the structure is almost by the book. Displacement of intolerable loss onto a scapegoat, followed by the projection of an idealized self onto a purified collective. It is pathological, but it is also entirely comprehensible as a response to genuine trauma. Now, apply the same framework to the people who were designated as the betrayers, however. If you do that, you get a whole spectrum of responses that we have already discussed. You can try to assimilate harder, and try to prove your loyalty by any available means. This is why we have things like the honorary Aryans, for example. Some migrate to Palestine, to America, or wherever the door is still open. Some internalize the nationalist framework and build their own version. That is Zionism at its core. It is the argument that the Jewish people need what every other people needs: a land, a state, and an identity rooted in sovereignty, rather than diaspora. Some sublimate the wound into intellectual work, however, and that is, broadly speaking, the Frankfurt School. Others, however, tip into the mirror image, and that is Kaufmann's Germany must perish, calling for the biological elimination of the German people through mass sterilization. It is this document that kind of hints at a tipping point. As deranged as it is also, in a terrible way, psychologically understandable. This is pretty much what it looks like when the pressure gets high enough and the lid comes flying off entirely. In a sense, Herzl and the Frankfurt School are two sides of the same coin that both inhabit this spectrum, both produced by the very same pressure, and both are very legible, but they are neither inevitable. Notably, both of these approaches have not yet stopped. The two poles that crystallized in the 1930s are still visible today in altered forms. Of course, we have the thing that we'll be talking about today, which is the universalist deconstructivist tendency that has now institutionalized itself across Western academia and media. But you also have, at the other extreme, variants of an ethnic particularism, for example the settler movement in the West Bank, or certain strands of Israeli ethno-nationalism represented by people like Ben Gvir. These are not necessarily the same thing as Nazism, but they are operating within the same psychological framework of in-group maximalism, all the while crystallizing identity to its hardest possible edge. Now, I would like to kind of come back to the hook of the video. Is cultural Marxism actually an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? Well, there's almost something funny about this, because if you actually believe in this conspiracy, then you would claim that there is a coordinated cabal of Jewish intellectuals that is deliberately subverting Western civilization. Now, It might not be coordinated, but it cannot just be hand-waved away. Setting aside the moral question, however, it's kind of structurally embarrassing, isn't it? It would mean that our civilization is being dismantled by a secret network whose most prominent members wrote books about sexual liberation and the sexual nature of play that read like, and I say this with complete sincerity, the most elaborately philosophically justified cry for help in the history of Western thought. Marcuse's Eros and Civilization is not the product of a cold strategic mind plotting the destruction of the West. It is the product of a deeply wounded man trying to construct a theory of human flourishing from inside a coping mechanism that became so all-encompassing that it became deranged. But if you genuinely believe that any of these are the coordinating documents of a civilizational destroying cabal, then I have to ask, what is our civilization made of, that it can be toppled down by German Jewish academics writing about Freud and Marx in Los Angeles in 1955? The answer is that it's obviously not necessarily a cabal, and it probably never was. The conspiracy framing is, if anything, way too comfortable for the people who don't like where these ideas have led. A cabal can be identified and stopped, if you want to, but what we actually have is much harder to deal with. Ideas that are mimetically potent, institutionally entrenched, and entirely self-replicating. No coordination is ever required, no committee is needed, there are no secret meetings. It is just a method that spreads because it's useful, because it's easy to apply, and it rewards the people who apply it at minimum investment on their end. And it is also prominent because the institutions that are now colonized by these ideas select for people that use them. That doesn't even have to be a conspiracy, it's just ecology. These ecologies, however, are much harder to change than a secret cabal. Now, the label anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is, well, in a way kinda funny, because it's used to end conversations, obviously. It doesn't really explain why these ideas emerged from the milieu at its moment. Obviously, the Frankfurt School's Marxist views cannot be separated from most of the thinkers being Jewish, but not because Jewishness necessarily leads there, but because it is more compatible with Marxism in 1930s Germany, unlike, for example, in Italy, where this was not the case. But the label alone really doesn't address anything at all. It doesn't tell you what these ideas have done to the institutions that they have captured. It doesn't really grapple with the genuine intellectual achievements of the work, or the genuine pathologies that the work has generated downstream. It also doesn't address where the word even comes from. In a way, it's a deeper irony. See, what this label actually is just a shutdown, and not an argument. We are kinda used to that anyway, aren't we? Because in a deeper irony, it is itself a demonstration of the critical theory method. You have to identify the political valence of an idea, a weak point or something that you can just make up and hold on to. If you name it as dangerous, then you can use this very naming as the grounds for dismissal of the idea. The Frankfurt School's intellectual descendants are using the Frankfurt School's intellectual toolkit to protect the school from criticism. Well, Adorno would have found this either deeply satisfying or deeply embarrassing, possibly both, because he was kinda weird like that. Now, critical theory is not a doctrine by itself. That is the single most important thing to understand about it, and the thing that gets lost most often. See, orthodox Marxism is kind of a Chad idea. It kind of Chad strides in, it tells you what is true, it has a positive theory, here's how history works, here's where it's going, and here is what to do. Of course, Marxism understands itself as the answer to history, and thus is kind of self-affirming. You can agree or disagree with it, well, unless you live under it, I suppose, but it makes definitive claims about itself. Critical theory, on the other hand, doesn't really work like that. It's a method, a mode of analysis, and its core operation is that, before accepting any claim about how society works, you have to ask whose interests that claim actually serves. What does this idea make invisible, and what would have to be true for this arrangement to seem natural and inevitable? These are fundamentally in a vacuum very potent philosophical tools, but here they are applied to political theory and systems. It is through this application that critical theory acts as a solvent. It is literally designed to dissolve the assumptions that hold a given social order together. It is to reveal the power relations hidden inside what looks like neutral description. Now, there is something genuinely valuable in this, as every intellectual tradition benefits from someone asking these questions. It is the willingness to interrogate hidden premises that is the mark of a serious thinker. But there is something dangerous about this, isn't it? Because if you apply it to systems, it immediately turns Marxist in a way. Because the reveal of hidden power relations hidden inside structures is actually forming a sort of class consciousness around these ideas, which then, for the Marxist, have to be overcome. This becomes much more obvious when we apply it to an example. Building something requires you to understand it completely. You have to understand the materials, the load-bearing structures, and every element and how it connects to the other. In essence, you have to know what you're doing. Dissolving something, however, only requires you to find one contradiction, one place where the claim doesn't really hold, where the ideal doesn't match the reality, where the structure serves some interests at the expense of others. And since every human institution does this, the solvent now has unlimited targets. Because every institution has winners and losers, every arrangement excludes something. This is how critical theory spreads so easily and so far beyond its origins. Because you actually don't need a complete alternative worldview to use it. You don't even need to have read Horkheimer. You don't even need to understand what you're dismantling. You just need the question: who benefits from this being taken for granted? Asking this question in the right tone at the right person lets you destabilize almost anything. This sort of question is especially potent if the person you are asking the question has no assertive will. These ideas, for example, they cannot work in places like China.
What is China afraid of to keep Tibet in such a tight control and Tibetans in such an inhuman existence in our own country?
Sir, ever since the Yuan dynasty, if not even earlier, Tibet has been part of China. I can assure you, during your lifetime and mine, Tibet will always be part of China. Tibet being part of China doesn't depend on whether you like it or not. It's a megatrend of our time. And you need to accept that before you will feel free to go back to China,
so
to visit Tibet.
You sound like you're threatening the man.
No, I'm not.
You said you have to accept that before you can go back. He's from that place.
You live in peace in Britain, that's good.
But he's a refugee.
But if you want to go back to Tibet, acknowledge Tibet is part of China, period.
And what if he doesn't? He can't go back to his home.
You cannot go back. Because China doesn't want to see anyone advocating for the independence of Tibet.
But they are really potent in the Western world. After you have lost a war and saw terrible strife, well then, you know we need to be extra careful. And thus, a person of average intelligence, equipped with this very method, can attack ideas and structures that are vastly more sophisticated than anything that they could ever build. It is the power of it. But it is also the obvious problem with critical theory. This problem creates a certain kind of intellectual who is very good at finding flaws. If you point him at anything, an argument, an institution, a tradition, a scientific consensus, whatever, he will locate the contradiction within it. The hidden assumptions, the power interest lurking inside, the claim to objectivity. He is quite nimble, relentless, often amusing, but, unlike me, he produces nothing. It takes genuine expertise to build an efficient system. An engineer who designs a bridge has to know structural mechanics, material science, load distribution, failure modes, and other things. If the bridge fails, then he is accountable for it. Likewise, the consequence is direct. The critical theorist, on the other hand, who deconstructs the bridge, who writes a paper about how the bridge's design reflects the class interests of the engineers who built it, or how its location disadvantages certain communities. He requires no such expertise. He needs no engineering knowledge, nor does he bear any responsibility for whether anything stands afterward. He can be entirely wrong about the bridge and still publish the paper and get tenure. What critical theory did when it migrated into the social sciences in particular was to give this dynamic institutional legitimacy. It made the intellectual freerider look like a serious thinker. The person who actually builds the model, however, and designs the experiment, as well as collects the data, see, he is embedded in the very system, captured by its hidden assumptions and blind to his own biases. And thus you need the critical theorist on his side, the person who interrogates his hidden assumptions from a position of total non-commitment. See, this person is actually doing the real work. You can see where this ends up very quickly. It is like a fat man on the couch that doesn't really know anything about football and criticizes the coach. And in the culture that has elevated criticism to the status of highest intellectual virtue, this fat man on the couch has become our present-day expert. The replication crisis in psychology and sociology is in part the bill coming due for this, when a field decides collectively that construct validity is less important than political salience, when implicit bias trainings get rolled out across institutions before anyone has established that the underlying construct is even real, let alone that the training changes anything. Then we are watching a field that has confused criticism with rigor. If you ever were to run an experiment with the methodological standards of an average implicit bias study, you would be laughed out of every hard science department in the world. Yet, in certain social science contexts, it can get you grant funding. The Frankfurt School thinkers, and Adorno especially, understood that Enlightenment rationality carried a shadow with it. It is the tendency to reduce everything to what is measurable, controllable, and useful. Art, myth, tradition, and sacred, all of these get ground down by the instrumental logic of modernity. This critique is real and, most importantly, not wrong. But the tool that the Frankfurt School built to address this problem is itself a form of the very same grinding mechanism. Critical theory doesn't make space for the sacred, it deconstructs it. It has to, because any totalizing structure, any claim to wholeness or rootedness or transcendence, looks like potential authoritarianism through the critical theory lens. Adorno's authoritarian personality is the crystallization of this very idea. The study attempts to show that certain psychological traits, like for example conventionalism, obedience to authority and attachment to in-groups, predict fascist sympathies. The implication is that a whole cluster of traditional values and social attachments are proto-fascist, when they really are, in fact, natural to the human condition. Attachment to tradition becomes suspicious. Pride in your community? Suspicious. Respect for established authority? Suspicious. Strong in-group identity? Suspicious. Almost like someone had a very bad experience with all of these ideas. But we can start seeing the problem here, can't we? Because if you pathologize the psychological roots of traditional social organization, if you make rootedness itself a symptom of something dangerous, then you don't get liberation, do you? We know this because we actually do live at the end of this pipeline. We get atomization. Individuals cut loose from every structure that once gave them orientation, belonging, or a sense of being part of something larger than themselves. Into this very vacuum, something will always move, however, because nature does not allow for empty space. If Horkheimer and Adorno are the theorists of the wound, then Marcuse is the theorist of the cure. And while the diagnosis is actually quite interesting, the cure frankly reads like something from a fever dream. Marcuse was essentially the first Gooner. Eros and Civilization, published in 1955, is Marcuse's attempt to synthesize Freud and Marx into a theory of liberation. If you've not read either, imagine the guy who thinks that he's a genius, but never worked a proper job in his life, and the over-analytical 30-year-old virgin synthesizing their ideas into the very first Redditor manifesto. The argument roughly runs as follows. Modern capitalist civilization requires the repression of our instinctual drives. Freud was more or less right about that. But the degree of repression required by capitalist civilization goes far beyond what's necessary for social life. According to Marcuse, it creates surplus repression, imposed to keep workers docile and productive. Liberation, therefore, means not just economic revolution, but the liberation of the eros, the erotic spirit, sexuality, play, and sensuousness. For Marcuse, play was always erotic. Before Reddit ever existed, Marcuse was essentially laying the philosophical groundwork. Eros and Civilization is, in a very real sense, the most earnest and least self-aware anticipation of modern transgression culture ever committed to paper. It is an enormously sincere book, and it is also, depending on your tolerance for this sort of thing, either a work of profound philosophical seriousness or the most elaborate justification for self-indulgence in the history of Western thought. By one-dimensional man in 1964, Marcuse has developed this into a critique of the entire cultural landscape of Western consumer society. The very system is so total and so efficient at absorbing and neutralizing opposition that genuine critique has become nearly impossible. See, I actually really like this idea quite a bit, and I will certainly steal from him when we get there. It is a very good reminder of how well these people can diagnose and how terrible they are at creating any solutions. Now, according to Marcuse, even pleasure has been colonized. The culture industry gives people what they want, and thus they stop wanting what they need. And naturally, since he's a Marxist, they need the Marxist revolution. Within Marcuse's framework, our society permits everything, as long as it doesn't threaten the structure, which is genuinely interesting analysis in places. But if you follow this to its logical conclusion, as the student movements of the 1960s have done, then you end up with something so profoundly stupid in its wrongness that only an academic could have come up with it. It essentially means that every established norm is repression. This means in practice that not attending the Pride Parade means that you yourself are probably part of the clientele, which is obviously stupid. Likewise, any structure is oppression, which naturally is also stupid. Liberation means transgression. Well, we can see where that goes, and the further from traditional life you can get, the more free you are. Well, you can ask modern women how free they really feel, torn between job and child, house and home. Regardless, combining all of these ideas is literally how you get the obese self-caricatures with colored hair. Yes, that's right, you can all thank Marcuse for these abominations, but most of them don't even know about it. And if they had read him, they would know that he would hate them as well, which is pretty based. One major thing that you get from him, however, is the sexual revolution. It is the dissolution of the family as an institution, the attack on authority as such. Marcuse's fingerprints are all over it. Not because he coordinated necessarily anything, but the ideas, once they are released, have their own momentum. The bitter irony in all of this is that all of it was supposed to be the antidote to fascism. It was supposed to be the deconstruction of authoritarian psychology and the liberation of the individual from the grip of the collective, the erosion of the strong identities that fascism had weaponized. But what it actually produced in many places was not liberated individuals. It was people with no sense of belonging, no roots, no story about who they are and where they come from. And those people are, as it turns out, extraordinarily susceptible to the first charismatic movement and idea that offers them exactly what they have been denied: identity, belonging, a sense of participation in something larger than themselves. See, Marcuse's teachings were meant to prevent fascism, but they have essentially recreated the conditions of Weimar Germany. This is why, under a lot of modern degeneracy, you can find posts like this. And then, for no reason, people voted Hitler. Believe it or not, this is actually a genuine structural counterpoint to everything that Marcuse thought he was building. Now there's a process that we need to touch on, because it explains how we got here. See, critical theory begins as a project of radical critique. It's explicitly anti-institutional, and it's supposed to be the intellectual equivalent of dynamite, but then something very strange happens. Marcuse's own prediction becomes reality. The system eats the revolution and institutionalizes it, but critical theory almost acts like a virus within it. In order to understand how this came about, we need to actually place a piece of the puzzle that we haven't touched on yet. This person does usually not get enough airtime in these discussions. It is Antonio Gramsci. He is a socialist and actually the person who coined the term cultural Marxism. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist writing from a fascist prison cell in 1930, which gives his work a certain concentrated quality. His problem was essentially the very same one that the Frankfurt school was wrestling with. Why hadn't the working class revolted? His answer was very different from Marx's understanding in a crucial way. See, in Marxism there's a concept of the base and the superstructure. The base is essentially all the product and the workers, anything that is tangible, and the superstructure is kind of the overarching narrative that holds it together. So, within the economic frame, for example, capitalism would be the superstructure, and the workers are the base. This is why Marxism came to the inevitable conclusion that the base will determine the superstructure by the workers rising up. All of this is very simplified, and it will certainly get its own video. Now for Gramsci, this kind of differs. See, the working class had revolted, Gramsci argued, because they had been culturally conditioned not to. The ruling class didn't just control the economy, it controlled the meaning-making apparatus, the schools, the press, the church, all the stories that the people told themselves about who they were and what was natural and inevitable. He called this cultural hegemony. The implication was devastating for orthodox Marxism because it cannot really change the economic base until you first change the cultural superstructure. Revolution has to happen in the people's minds, in their institutions, in their very assumptions, before it can happen in the streets. This is the very transmission belt. It is how the Frankfurt school theory connects to the institutional capture that we are about to discuss. Because if the cultural hegemony is the mechanism of oppression, the superstructure, then the revolutionary projection isn't to seize the means of production alone. It is first to seize the means of purpose production. The universities, the media, the schools. Rudi Deuschke, a German student activist in the 60s, gave this strategy its most memorable name. You have likely heard about it. It is the long march through the institutions. It is not a revolution from the barricades, it is instead the occupation of the meaning-producing structures from within. You have to get your people into the positions that shape what is thinkable. You have to do it slowly, patiently and over decades, and then you have to wait. There is not a single political party in modern life that doesn't understand this reality. This is why everyone is out to influence the media all the time. And also why things like the message exist. Now these ideas, they travel downstream from the Frankfurt School into American academia. Columbia, Brandeis, various other universities where the exiled scholars land and socialist professors kinda teach anyway. From there they move into sociology, literary criticism and philosophy. By the 60s and 70s, they are part of the standard intellectual vocabulary of the American university. And here, the 60s counterculture is actually a critical hinge. It's the point where the Atlantic transmission really catches, bouncing back and forth between American campuses and European ones in a feedback loop that amplifies itself. By the 80s and 90s, they are flowing downstream into policy, journalism, human resources, corporate diversity functions, NGOs and international institutions. At each step of the migration, something crucial is lost, however. The original thinkers, whatever their flaws were wrestling with a genuine tragedy, and so some of the degeneracy can be excused, as they had intellectual skin in the game, and their framework was quite extreme because their circumstances were extreme. The bureaucrat deploying critical theory frameworks in a large organization in 2010 is, however, not responding to any such catastrophes. Even if she really wishes that she was. Sharon is instead applying a set of analytical tools that she learned in graduate school. She has no stake in the deeper questions that these tools were designed to answer. What she has, however, is a method for identifying power imbalances and articulating grievances about these imbalances. This method is endlessly applicable whether she's talking to her husband, the poor bastard, her professor, her boss, or her colleagues. As every institution has contradictions, every arrangement of power includes some and excludes others. Every tradition involves choices that foreclose other choices. If you apply critical theory to that, you can always find something to dissolve. This is what I would like to call the managerial application of critical theory. It's almost an oxymoron. It doesn't require any bad intentions. It doesn't even require anyone to be a committed ideologue, although that certainly speeds things up quite a bit. It just requires that the tools are in the room and that using them is worth it. The radical critique of institutions gets captured by the very institutions that it was supposed to destroy, and the people that run these institutions are now armed with a method of identifying oppressive structures. They then, subconsciously, gradually, and even without meaning to, dismantle the load-bearing elements of the very things that they are supposed to be running. This itself becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop. The deconstructivist bureaucrats make systems less efficient. Less efficient systems, however, generate more problems, which naturally require more people to manage them. A larger bureaucracy, however, is then itself a sign of an oppressive, bloated superstructure, which naturally requires more oversight from critical frameworks and bureaucrats trained in identifying what is wrong with large systems. The institution thus endlessly devours, and then it hires someone to write a report about why it is still hungry. To really understand how destructive this is, we should take a moment and appreciate the contrast with the historical forebearers that run these systems. The numbers are quite frankly insane. Take, for example, the Indian civil service. The administrative spine of the British Empire across the entire subcontinent has never exceeded 1,200 officers. That is 1,200 people directing the affairs of over 300 million Indians across 250 districts and more than 450 princely states. One British administrator for roughly every 250,000 people. And it was, by most historical accounts, reasonably functional. It collected taxes, maintained infrastructure and kept records, as well as administered courts. Today the United Kingdom civil service is insanely bloated. It employs around 550,000 people to administer a population of 68 million, a country 1/5 the size of British India, requiring an administrative apparatus that is 450 times larger. The ratio has gone from 1 administrator per 250,000 people to roughly 1 per 124. Another great example would be Prussia. It taxed its highest earners, and I really want you to hold on to your seats for this one, guys, a top rate of 4%. That's right, 4%. Total tax revenue amounted to roughly 5% of national income. That was the overhead cost of one of the most effective state-building projects in European history. Today, a German worker on a middle-class income hands over somewhere between 45 and 48% of gross earnings between income tax and mandatory social contributions. Likewise, Britain is not that far behind, which is actually kind of funny to think about. 45% to 50% extraction rate is, incidentally, approximately what the Soviet government was extracting from its economy in the final years before its own collapse. Of course, it was doing so through state ownership rather than taxation, but the math lands in the same place essentially. But naturally, the Soviet Union is of course a Marxist state that is run by bureaucrats. Oh well, look at that. The more things change, the more they stay the same, huh? Now you see, there's a genre of post-apocalyptic fiction that understands something about power vacuums that most political theory doesn't really quite get. If you take away the overarching structure, like the federal government, the shared frame, the thing that however imperfectly provided common rules of engagement, then you don't really get free individuals. Instead you get factions, each with its own internal logic, its own hierarchy, its own claim to legitimacy, and since there is no neutral ground left, no higher court to appeal to that both sides can ever recognize, every dispute becomes existential, every conflict is winner-take-all. This is, in essence, what happens when you deconstruct the common framework. Critical theory correctly identifies that overarching structures can be oppressive. Now, the only reason this is even attractive to us here in the West is because our form of oppression was pathologized in the Second World War. But I don't really care about that, to be honest. One thing that critical theory can never adequately answer, and possibly couldn't, given who the architects are, is whether or not this oppression is justified or even good. Oppressive compared to what exactly? What is your alternative? It would appear that your alternative isn't freedom. It is instead smaller, meaner, and more arbitrary power. It's the faction that was most prepared for the vacuum, that can operate without constraint, that will win out. Critical theory becomes specifically vicious through the critique asymmetry. Critical theory as a tool doesn't really disappear when the overarching structure does. It gets picked up by whichever group is the most fluent in it, and is then deployed as a weapon against all other groups, while being structurally unavailable as a defense, because it has no positions of its own. And because any arrangement of power, including the one that your group is quietly building, can be deconstructed, there is no position from which you can ever say that your power arrangements are justified, that isn't immediately vulnerable to the very same method, and thus you get a permanent offensive advantage for whoever swings the solvent first at the other, and no legitimate way to establish rules that both sides can ever follow. This is why the social justice warrior stereotype is continuously chimping out, is because attack is literally the only mode that they can operate on, because they have no values of their own. They are essentially a personified version of rules for thee and not for me. Not as a conscious hypocrisy, but as an actual structural inevitability within their framework. This brings us to the Gramscian endgame and the nation-state itself. Now you see, this is kind of where the cultural hegemony, and thus the cultural Marxist argument, actually completes its own arc. And it is also where it lands on the specific target that matters most for the present day. If the mechanism of oppression is really cultural hegemony, so the stories that the people tell themselves about who they are and what is natural, then the actual superstructure is the nation-state, because it is not just a political structure to be reformed, it is the primary vehicle of this supremacy. It is within the nation-state that belonging can even live. It is where the story of us gets told, transmitted, and defended. It is, in the Gramscian term, the central site of ideological reproduction, which means it itself has to become the central target of deconstruction. Europe has an identity problem precisely because of this. And so, in a different register, does America, where the same institutional capture played out through different channels but produced the same outcome. It is guilt, shame, and the delegitimization of particular heritage as the precondition for moral standing. The European nation-state is built, however, on something that has become almost unspeakable in polite company, hasn't it? The idea that a state is the political expression of a people, not just any administrative arrangement in any given place for whoever happens to live within this border, but the organized self-governance of a nation, a community bound by shared language, history, culture, and in most cases ancestry. What critical theory does to all of this is that it makes the claim indefensible. Every narrative that privileges a certain particular heritage, every immigration policy that reflects demographic preferences, and every public symbol that roots the state in a particular people, these all represent as exactly the kind of totalizing, exclusionary structure that critical theory is built to deconstruct. The nation doesn't get abolished, it gets made unspeakable, but eventually, a thing that you cannot defend or speak will eventually be lost. There's a small caveat that I would like to add, however. A country is a construct. It's just the nation's systems, the bureaucracy, the institutions, etc. A nation, however, is something older. It is a wish of a people from a place to become brothers and sisters, sons and daughters of a particular spiritual home. You can make a people stateless, but you cannot really dissolve the thing itself. See, the idea or the structure of a German nation existed in the minds of these people before any Roman ever drew a map of the Black Forest. We can see this in the word Deutsch alone. It comes from the Proto-Germanic Teudo, which means simply the people. Deutschland is the land of these people in the very literal sense of the word. It was always that, long before it had any clear borders. Now, critical theory does something to this that is best exemplified through this very image, a garden. Now see, a beautiful garden requires a wall, something to mark out its own perimeter. Now the garden doesn't require a wall because it is beautiful by itself, and neither because nothing outside of the wall has no value. It is instead because without a defined perimeter, you really don't have a garden, do you? You just have a field that is gradually being colonized by whatever grows most aggressively. The wall is, in a sense, a totalizing structure. It makes an absolute distinction, the inside and the outside. It excludes by its very nature. You can apply the critical theory lens to this garden wall, and you will find many contradictions. The wall privileges certain plants and excludes others. The arrangements inside reflects choices made by a gardener with particular preferences, and these preferences cannot be universalized, and thus they must be wrong. The wall is an exercise of power. Now all of that is technically true, but if you remove the wall on those grounds, then you don't really get a garden, do you? The nation-state is the spiritual garden wall for any civilization. It is the very structure that makes the beautiful things inside of it possible. The art, the literature, the music, the particular way of life that is different here than it is there. It is the accumulated wisdom of a people living together over centuries and learning, slowly and painfully, how to do it. You can criticize any particular wall. You can argue that it's in the wrong place, for example Elsass-Lot. You can criticize any particular wall. You can argue that it's in the wrong place, that it was too high, or that the gates are too narrow. All of these are legitimate conversations that we should have. Pathologizing all of this produces the conditions for exactly what it claimed to prevent in the first place, doesn't it? It would create a faction that is waiting. It is a movement that would offer identity to people who have been told that they are not allowed to have one. Marcuse set out to prevent Weimar by recreating its own conditions. Now that's quite interesting psychologically. See, I'm of the very firm opinion that some of these ideas are actually not had by people. It is instead the idea that has the person. And the idea will self-actualize through the actions of the person. It is a bit esoteric, but I really like this kind of view because it helps me to explain this problem. See, if the Frankfurt School actually wanted to prevent fascism from rising ever again, then why does it remove all structure and actually induce the very same circumstances in which fascism itself will form? Probably because they are sore losers. Now you can't blame them for it, because losing in this way is pretty tough. But as Marxists, they should understand that if you show somebody how little they have, you make them more conscious of it, right? That's how class consciousness works in Marxism. Likewise, if you remove someone's identity, don't you make him more conscious of that? Now one could argue that a rematch is essentially the goal of this entire endeavor, but this time of course the right ones will win, right? Marxism will win out, because it's inevitable. And with this, I think we'll end the first episode. The Frankfurt School emerges from a very specific wound. Displaced intellectuals formed in, well, more or less the German tradition, watching from exile as this very tradition's darkest impulses take power. They build a set of analytical tools that are designed to understand how that even happened, and to prevent it from happening again, or maybe try to win this time. Those tools are very powerful. The analysis of how mass culture produces conformity, how Enlightenment rationality carries a shadow, and how ordinary people get swept into authoritarian movements. All of that is not trivial intellectual work. It deserves to be engaged with seriously. But the tools were built for a very specific problem. If you apply them everywhere, indefinitely, especially by people who don't even share and, in many cases, don't know the original context, well, then these ideas become something else. They become the universal solvent that we experience, the thing that dissolves whatever it touches, including the structures that make human life and civilization even possible. The Frankfurt School set out to understand how fascism could emerge from modern civilization, and by doing so, they may have done more than anybody else to dissolve the structures that stand between civilization and its alternatives. Good job. But, however you call it, none of this is necessarily a conspiracy. It seems more to be a tragedy, and like any tragedy, it contains genuine greatness alongside its pathologies. And thus, in the next 4 episodes, we're going to look at a few of the major figures a bit closer. Horkheimer, Adorno and Marcuse will definitely be in there. My wildcard is Walter Benjamin. He's a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone in this story, what it means when a culture loses its ability to produce things that are genuinely itself. Each of them took the founding wound of the Frankfurt School, the trauma, and ran with it in a different direction. Some of those directions illuminate things worth understanding, and some are genuinely deranged. And some, I think, are both. Which is what makes all of this, hopefully, worth your time.